Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about sensation basics. We're going to talk about visual processing and the parts of the eye that contribute to a process called transduction. Before we get started, we're going to briefly review the difference between sensation and perception. So recall that we spoke about sensation earlier. That sensation involves bottom-up processing. And that means taking in stimulus energy from the outside environment and transducing it into a neural impulse. So sensation is gathering resources or raw materials from the external environment. Perception is the process of turning that stimulus energy into neural impulses so the brain can read and understand. This is called top-down processing. And this is where we select, organize, and interpret incoming information from the outside world. In order to do this, first we're going to look at vision, and we're going to look at basics of the eye and how the eye transduces that electromagnetic energy and turns it into a neural impulse. One thing to remember before we begin here is that for sighted people, when they gather information from the outside world, our vision tends to overwhelm all of our other senses when they're in competition. This tendency is called visual capture, and basically an example of this is when you're at the movies and we see an actor on screen or an actress on screen and they're talking. We perceive that voice to be coming from their mouth on the screen, but in reality, that sound of their voice is coming from the speakers on the side of the theater. But when we see them talking on the screen, our visual sensation or perception overwhelms our auditory sensation, and it sounds like that voice is actually coming from their mouth on the screen. So transduction is a process that we're going to talk about. And that's when sensory energy is transduced or translated into a neural impulse. Think of light that reflects from objects to our eye is translated into a neural impulse that the brain can read. So as we move to the eye, we're going to look at the basic components of the eye. And remember, each part of the eye plays a pivotal role in transducing light so our brain can read it. And we'll talk about each of those parts separately. You should be able to understand how each part contributes to that transduction process. So if we take a look at how light travels into the eye and the order in which it's processed, we're first going to look at the cornea. And light travels through the cornea, which is a clear, transparent protective coating on the front part of our eye. And a lot of people don't know that the cornea is responsible for most of our focusing of the light. Maybe 80% of our focusing capability is done by the cornea. And it also is a protective coating on the outer layer of the eye. Once light passes by the cornea, it then travels through a watery substance called the aqueous humor. This lies behind the cornea right here. And it really serves the purpose of nourishing the lens and keeping the lens moist so it's flexible and pliable. Next, light travels through the pupil and the iris. Now, the pupil is that small opening, that dark opening in the center of our eye. And light travels through it, and depending on how bright or dark it is in the environment that we're in, that opening can get larger or smaller. If it constricts during bright light, that means that it gets smaller, and light will focus on a very small pathway to the back of the eye. So when it's very bright outside, our pupil is constricted, and light focuses right in the back center of the eye where most of our visual acuity occurs. If it is dark and that pupil dilates, which opens up, means it opens up very wide. Light then hits a much greater portion of the back of our eye, where some of our detectors in dim light work on the periphery out here, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Okay, and the iris is the colored part of the eye, so that's actually the muscle that controls how wide the opening of the pupil is. So if your iris is blue or green, and they say, hey, you have blue eyes and green eyes, but that really controls how large the pupil is in the eye. Next, we have the lens. The lens is certainly important because it is the fine-tuning of our focusing. So this is the fine details, the last part of our focusing process. And it's pliable, so when we're relaxed and looking in the distance, the lens is long and tall and thin. And when we are focusing on objects close up, there are muscles that make the lens shorter and fatter. So looking off in the distance, our lens is relaxed, and when we are focusing on something nearby, our lens is short and fat. So next, I'm going to erase a little bit of this information here. As light travels to the back of the eye, it has to go through this cavity in here, and this is called the vitreous body. This is a clear jelly-like substance that maintains the shape of the eye, kind of like the air in a basketball, and it keeps the retina in place on the back of the eye. The retina is very thin, tissue paper thin layer of photosensitive cells. So if we go back now and we talk about the retina is a lining in the back of the eye. It contains all of our photoreceptor cells that are sensitive to light, the only place in the body where we have those special type of cells that translate light into neural impulses. There's another part of the eye, the fovea, that we kind of lost in our drawing here. And we're going to kind of draw that back here. This little indentation in the direct center back of the eye contains most of the cones, and the cones are responsible for color detection and visual acuity. A couple other processes I want to mention briefly before we get to transduction. One of those processes is called dark adaptation, and this is the process of adjusting to diminishing light. So as the sun goes down at sunset, at dusk, until it is totally dark, our pupil will gradually dilate and, constrict, and we get more sensitive to lower light levels. And this takes about 20 to 30 minutes, which is actually about the same amount of time it takes to go from dusk to darkness. Probably not a coincidence. This is, evolutionarily speaking, an advantage for us to always be maximally sensitive to how much light there is. A couple of problems with vision that we're probably familiar with: myopia, which refers to nearsightedness. That means we can see things close, but things off in the distance are blurry. And that's probably caused because the chamber of the eye is a little bit too long for us. So if we look up here at our diagram, light focuses a little bit too close to the front of the eye, and then by the time it gets to the retina, it is again out of focus. Hyperopia, which is farsightedness, means we can see things far away clearly, but objects that are nearby are blurry, and that's probably because the eye chamber is a little too short. And as light comes in, it focuses behind the retina, so it's not in focus by the time it gets to the retina. We also have something called a blind spot, otherwise known as the optic disc. If we go back to the previous slide, we can see in our diagram where the optic disc is. Right here in the back of the eye, all of our cells from the gathering light from the eye have to leave and go to the brain. And in that spot, there are no photosensitive cells. That means we do have literally a blind spot in each eye where we don't have any photosensitive cells. but we'll talk about that a little bit later on why we don't actually see a blind spot in our eye. So those are the parts of the eye that help in transduction. We're going to talk about transduction a little bit more and a little bit more about the retina in our next video clip. So feel free to rewind and also read ahead, and in our next video we'll talk about the retina. Thank you.